Hi everyone. So learning theology has been a hobby of mine for a while now, and like many armchair theologians, very early on I came across St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and like many, the first time I tried to read it, it was a disaster. I just didn't get it. Why was Aquinas saying one thing and then another? What's he actually trying to argue? So I quickly gave up, and I decided that it just wasn't for me, and I moved on to other things. Then last fall, I took a sacramental theology class, which had a unit where we had to break down and summarize a bunch of Summa articles. So I knew I had to learn how to read them, so I looked up how to read the Summa Theologica. And I was amazed at how much difference it made to learn how to read the Summa. Suddenly, what Aquinas was arguing came into focus. It was exciting. And I was so excited, I emailed my pastor and I asked him if I could teach others the trick of reading the Summa. And surprisingly enough, he let me. So I taught a one-night class on Aquinas' feast day this past January. That was a few months ago, so I am a little rusty on all this, but I wanted to try to capture a bit of that presentation for you all at home. So we'll start first by looking at why a person would even want to try and read the Summa. Then we'll go into some background about Thomas Aquinas, and finally we'll dive into the Summa itself. So before we jump into Aquinas or the Summa, first I want to talk a little bit about why you would want to study this stuff. Why learn theology? Why dig more deeply into it? Isn't it enough to just pray and have faith? Well, it all goes back to one of the first questions from the Baltimore Catechism. Now, some of you might remember having learned the Baltimore Catechism when you were younger. You had to learn the questions and the answer and be able to recite them when asked. Now, personally, I don't remember that. We didn't do that when I was growing up, but some of you might remember this question. So the question is, why did God make me? Do you remember? Well, the answer to that is, God made me to know him, to love him, to serve him in this world, so as to be happy with him forever in the next. Think about that. God wants us to know him so that we can better love him and serve him. If you love someone, you want to get to know them better. You want to know their favorite ice cream, or how they grew up, or how they like their coffee. And if we really love God, we want to get to know him better too. How can you say you love someone if you don't care to learn what they're like or what's important to them? And we're also called to serve God. And how can we serve him properly if we don't even know what it means to serve God, or how we should do that, or why? If we truly love God, we want to come to know him better each and every day, and that's where the study of theology comes in. Now, it's a common misconception that faith and reason are opposed to each other. Some people might be afraid to dig too far deeply into theology out of fear that their reason might undermine their faith. Or you might hear some people, mostly edgy atheists, I know because I was one, who say that having faith means you have to abandon your reason, and if you think things through too deeply, you would realize that your faith is unreasonable. And you can tell those people have never read Aquinas. So the Catholic Church teaches that faith and reason are complementary. They work together. God gave us our powers of reason so that we might come to know him better. And two Vatican documents, which go into this more deeply and which I encourage everyone to read, because they're both pretty short and they're available for free online, are the Vatican I document De Filius and Pope John Paul II's encyclical Fides et Ratio, which means faith and reason. So both of these offer a beautiful explanation of the place of reason in the Catholic faith. And Fides et Ratio contains one of my favorite quotes from John Paul II, where he says, "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth." So we need both faith and reason to have a well-rounded understanding of God and a well-rounded relationship with God. So this brings me to the final piece of the discussion of faith and reason, which is called the hermeneutic circle. Now, hermeneutics is just a big word that means understanding. You might hear people talk about approaching scripture with a certain hermeneutic, or a certain understanding. The hermeneutic circle is the circle of understanding. You start by looking at the big picture. Then maybe a question pops into your mind. To answer that question, you have to break the topic down into smaller parts and understand the details more deeply. Then you incorporate that deeper understanding back into your view of the whole picture. Now, it can get dangerous to allow yourself to get stuck at any one point in the circle for too long. If you stay at the big picture too long, you stagnate in growth. You're not growing in your knowledge or your understanding, and you can stay overly simplistic, or you risk not coming to know God better, or not giving yourself the tools for when the inevitable question does come up. Likewise, if you allow yourself to be bogged down in the small details for too long, you risk losing sight of the big picture, which can be very dangerous for your faith life. It can make you scrupulous or legalistic, or it can cause you to lose faith over small misunderstood details. So it's very important throughout your faith life to be continually moving through that circle, from big picture to details and back again. It's this drive to come to know and understand God better that leads us to study theology, and that's where learning to read the Summa can come in handy for spiritual growth. So before we jump into the Summa, I just want to go over a little bit about St. Thomas Aquinas to sort of set the scene, see where he's coming from, and knowing where he came from and why he wrote the Summa will help us to understand it better, because we can sort of put ourselves in his place. So Thomas Aquinas was born around 1225 in Roccasecca, Italy. And I'm probably saying that wrong, so I apologize for people who actually have been to Italy and know how to pronounce these things. And his father was Lord of Aquino, so that's why he's called Thomas Aquinas, or Thomas from Aquino. So he was born to a noble family, and at the time, if you were born to a noble family, you would be expected to go into a certain line of work. So for a noble person, if you wanted to enter religious life, then you would enter a rich abbey or monastery, and sometimes they would set you up to be the next abbot. So all that was set out for you from the time you were young. So when Aquinas was 5 years old, his family sent him off to study at a Benedictine monastery, the monastery of Monte Cassino. And even from a very young age, he was known to ask very deep questions. He would ask his teacher, "What is God?" Which is the type of question that we now know Aquinas for, but coming from a 5-year-old, that is a very, very deep question. So he very quickly surpassed what the monks there could teach him. So when he was around 11 years old, they sent him off to Naples to go to university. So to understand the environment he found himself in when he went to university, it's important to remember that right around this time, there were 3 major changes happening in society and in the church and in the system of learning at the time. So these 3 changes will be very important to understanding what's going on with Aquinas at that time period. So the 3 changes are, first, there's the move away from monastic life. So before this time period, if you wanted to enter religious life, you would go to a monastery. You would become a cloistered monk, and you would study, and it was very hierarchical. You had your abbot who was in charge of everything, and then the monks under him. Abbeys were very rich. It was very structured. But right around that time was when the first mendicant orders started being developed, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And nowadays, we're so used to these Franciscans and Dominicans that we don't think twice, but at the time, they saw them as scoundrels. They didn't have an abbey to live in, they weren't as structured and disciplined, they wandered around, they took a vow of poverty, they didn't have any money, they begged. This was seen as an affront to structured society at the time. So that was very polarizing for people. Another change that was going on at the time was the rise of universities. And this also goes back to those abbeys. Before that, those abbeys, those monasteries, were the centers of learning. That's where all the learning and the study would take place. Now that was shifting to the university system, and many people high up did not like that the power of academics and teaching, who was shaping the young minds, this was was changing from the monasteries to the university system. And then the final change was the translation of the works of Aristotle into Latin. So before this time, only the very basic works of Aristotle had been translated into Latin, but very soon before Aquinas came onto the scene, vast quantities of Aristotle's works had been translated into Latin, and that was shaping how people viewed theology. It was changing our understanding of theology, and again, this was very polarizing. Not everybody liked those changes, not everybody agreed with it, and Aquinas, he found himself right on the forefront of all three of those. First, he joined those scoundrel mendicant orders. He wanted to become a Dominican, whereas his father wanted him to become a rich abbot of a very structured, rich monastery. And then he also went away to a university. He found himself in the university system. And finally, he had been introduced to those works of Aristotle, and they were shaping the way he viewed theology. It was what he based his theology on. So he was in a very difficult position at that time. So his family, his brothers and his father, they did what any rich parents would do when your son runs off and joins the Dominicans. They kidnapped him and they locked him in a tower. So Aquinas was locked in the tower for 2 years. Okay, and during that time, one of the more famous stories of Aquinas took place. So the story goes that his brothers, in an attempt to convince him not to join the Dominicans, they got a prostitute and they sent her up to his room to attempt to seduce him. So Aquinas, who would not be deterred from his vocation, he pulled a hot poker out of the fire and chased her out of the room and slammed the door behind her, and he burned a cross on the door with the hot poker. And I mean, Aquinas was not a small guy, so if you can imagine this giant guy coming at you with a hot poker. And then the story goes that he knelt down and prayed, and that night he was visited by an angel who wrapped a golden rope around his loins, and Aquinas was never tempted by lust again. So that's the big story from his time of imprisonment. The other thing that he was doing up there, besides being tempted by prostitutes, is he was studying. So he didn't waste that time. His sister actually was able to sneak him 3 books. So she snuck him the Bible, Aristotle's Logic, and the Sentences of Peter Lombard, which was the go-to textbook at the time for beginner theology students. And Aquinas studied those throughout his time in the tower. And by the time he was rescued, his teachers would actually say that he learned more in his 2 years locked in the tower than many would have learned in 2 years at university. So he didn't waste that time. But he was eventually rescued with the help of his mother and his sister. He escaped. He was lowered from a basket, as the story goes, just like Paul from prison, and he was rescued right into the waiting arms of the Dominicans. And as I said, he is not a small guy, so it must have been a pretty big basket. So they took him on a horse by night, and he escaped. So after he was rescued and he rejoined the Dominicans, they sent him off to university in Paris to study. And that's when he studied under St. Albert the Great. He was his theology teacher. And at the time, he was a very quiet student. He didn't say very much. So his classmates, they mistook that for him being kind of slow, and that's when he got the nickname the Dumb Ox. So they thought that he wasn't very smart, so they called him Dumb Ox. You know, he was this big lumbering guy, didn't say much, and that's when St. Albert the Great said, this dumb ox will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world. And obviously that is very much the case. So he went with Albert the Great to Cologne to study for a little bit, Cologne, Germany, and then he returned to Paris, he finished his degree, and he began teaching. So at first, when he started teaching, he focused, as I said, on Lombard's Sentences. That was the textbook for beginning theology students at the time. And he taught and he wrote a lot. Like he wrote and he wrote, and he was such a prolific writer while he was teaching. And then eventually he was given more and more responsibility. And the Dominicans, they put him in charge of the training for all their young friars, and they gave him the opportunity to establish his own university, which he did at Naples, and he could write his own curriculum, which is like a teacher's dream to be able to write your own curriculum. And you have to remember that most of these young men who were joining the Dominicans, they didn't really need to be deep, deep theologians. They were, the Dominicans at the time, they had the purpose of preaching and hearing confessions. So they had to be able to preach so that the average parishioner could understand them, so that they could teach the average parishioner, but they didn't have to be these amazing theologians. So Aquinas wanted to write his curriculum in a way that would give them a very good base in basic theology so that they could do their jobs well. That was his goal. And he thought that the sentences and other summas at the time, summa just means a summary, so there were lots of summas floating around at the time that were attempting to summarize all of theology for these students. They jumped around a lot. He thought the way they were organized was very illogical. They repeated themselves a lot, and they just weren't very good for teaching. So his goal was to write a curriculum that encompassed all of theology in a way that was very logical, that built upon itself, and that would lead his students from the basics through advanced theology in a very logical, structured manner. And that's why he wrote his Summa Theologica. And that brings us pretty much to the end of Aquinas' life. So that's what he did with the rest of his life. He taught and he wrote. He wrote a lot. He didn't just write the Summa. He wrote other works about theology. He wrote Bible commentaries. He wrote letters. He just wrote and wrote and wrote. And the story goes that he could write, he could dictate to 4 different scribes, 4 different works on 4 different topics all at the same time, keep it in his head. He was just such a prolific writer, and he just wrote so much. But then, at the end of his life, I think it was the Feast of St. Nicholas, he was praying when he got a vision. He got access to this beatific vision, which is what we see when, if we go to heaven, we see the beatific vision, where just everything about God is revealed to us. We can see it all. So he was graced with this vision, and when he came out of it, he said to his fellow friars, he said, "Everything I've written seems to me like straw compared to what has been revealed to me." So he's written all these great works of theology, but it just barely scratches the surface on the actual reality of God, which had been revealed to him. And after that, he refused to write anymore. He just stopped writing. He didn't finish the Summa. It remained unfinished, and he refused to write anymore. And then he was ordered to go on a trip, and while he was on that trip, he fell ill. And he was dying. So at first, he was brought to one of his family's house, but then he told them, I'm a religious, I want to die in a religious house. So they brought him to a Cistercian monastery, and on his deathbed, these Cistercians, they had heard about the great Thomas Aquinas. They wanted him to write something for him. They asked him to write a Bible commentary for him. So he's dictating this Bible commentary on his deathbed, and then he passed away in this Cistercian monastery, and the Dominicans actually had to fight to get his body back. They knew that he was going to be this great saint. They wanted to hold on to his body and keep it for themselves, which, that's kind of a weird Catholic thing to take the saint's body. But anyway, they did give the body back to the Dominicans, and Thomas Aquinas died at the age of 49 with his great work, the Summa, unfinished. So for this next part, I'm going to switch it into slide mode because there's a lot to it, and I think it'll be easier to follow along. So we're going to talk about how the Summa is organized. So the Summa is split first into parts, and then each of those parts is split into questions, and each of those questions is split into articles. So the parts of the Summa, there are 5 parts. There's part 1, there's the first part of part 2, the second part of part 2, there's part 3 and the supplement, and then there's appendix 1 and appendix 2. So remember we talked about how St. Thomas Aquinas, he wanted to create a very logical curriculum that could take his students from the basic to the advanced in a very logical progression. So we see this here, first of all, in the parts. So part 1 starts with God, the very basics of God. Who is God? How do we know he exists? What is God? So all this is learning about God and about the story of man's relationship with God, how we fell out of God's favor, how we sinned and we fell and we were lost from God's graces. And then the rest of the Summa works on how God brings us back to his grace. So this is another circle. We talked about the hermeneutic circle. This is called the golden circle. So in the golden circle, man falls out of grace with God, and then the entire story of salvation here is how God works to bring man back to himself. And that's the pattern that the entire Summa follows. So in part 1, man sins, man falls out of God's favor, and then part 2 talks about how we get back to God. So it starts by talking about morality in general. What do these concepts of morality mean? And then between the first part of the second part and the second part of the second part, there's an article on grace. What is grace? And then the second part of the second part talks about how God's grace influences our morality, how he helps us become more virtuous. So it's through that grace that we become virtuous, that God brings us back to himself. So the first part of the first part of the second part is very theoretical. What is morality? What do these concepts of morality mean? Whereas the second part of the second part is very practical. How do we practice this morality? And then the third part talks about Christ, the incarnation, the sacraments, everything that Christ has done for us to help bring us back into God's graces. So there's that exit where man sins and falls away from God, and then the whole rest of it is showing how we are returned to God. So the next part are the questions. So each of these parts is split up into questions. And the term question is a bit of a misnomer because they're not really written in the form of the question. They're more like broad topics. So there are 614 of these altogether. Some examples of them, we have part 1, question 2, is the existence of God. So everything under that question will have to do with the existence of God. And then part 2, the second part of part 2, question 142 is vices contrary to temperance. And then our final example, part 3, question 69, talks about the effects of baptism. So everything under that topic would be about the effects of baptism. So next we have the articles. Each of those questions is split up into multiple articles. And now the articles are actually written in the form of a question. So the questions are not questions, the questions are broad topics, but the articles are the individual questions. This is the smallest unit, the smallest topic in the Summa. There are 3,125 of those, so there's a lot of them. And some examples of these would be part 1, question 2, article 1, is the existence of God self-evident? Or part 1, question 2, article 2, can we demonstrate that God exists? Part 1, question 2, article 3, does God exist? So in each of these articles, he's trying to answer those specific questions. So now we have to look at how to read the article itself. So as I said, the article is that smallest unit in the Summa, and learning how to read an article is really the key to understanding the Summa and to be able to know what it's saying, what Thomas Aquinas is trying to say here. So he starts off by giving objections. So before he gives his own answer, he plays devil's advocate. He gives us the reasons against his answer. And then he gets to on the contrary. When he says on the contrary, that's the experts weighing in. So he appeals to scripture or to the church fathers. He tells us, what some of the experts think on this topic. Next we have I answer that. And this is the real meat of the article. This is where Aquinas gives his answer, what he really thinks. And then finally at the end, he goes back and he replies to those objections that he started out with. So he kind of starts a little backwards, and if you don't know that this is how it's organized, it can be really confusing the first time you try to read an article, because he starts out by giving the opposite answer. If he thinks the answer is yes, he'll start out by telling you the no answer, by giving you arguments for the no answer. So you have to keep that in mind and not get thrown off by that. So next the question becomes, why did he write that way? So remember we were talking about that university system, how St. Thomas Aquinas was teaching at a university. He actually had the opportunity to begin his own university in Naples. So the way university classes were run at that time was called the scholastic approach to education. That's why people who follow Thomas Aquinas are referred to as the scholastics, because they used this scholastic method. So in the scholastic method of teaching, the teacher would present a question to his students, and it was the student's job to find both the yes and the no answer. They had to provide reasoning and provide arguments for both sides of the equation, and they would present both of these sides to the teacher, and then the next day the teacher would come back and he would present his answer. So this was sort of the form that Thomas Aquinas was following with his Summa, is he was copying how a class would be run at the university. So first he gives you the no side of the equation, then he presents the arguments, he presents his on the contrary by looking at the sources. What do the fathers say? What do other theologians say? What does the Bible say? And then he gives you his answer, his I answer that. And again, that's the meat of the article. That's Thomas Aquinas's answer. And then finally he goes back and he answers the objections, just like a teacher would critiquing his students' arguments. He goes back and he critiques those objections and tells you why they're wrong. Okay, so you can see I've been working on this so long that it's actually starting to get dark around me. So we looked at who Thomas Aquinas is, we looked at how the Summa is organized, and why he chose to organize it that way. So now it's just about time to jump into an actual article and see if we can understand it. So I tried to pick one that was a little easier to understand. I picked one that had to do with the sacraments, because I figure we all have a little bit of a background on the sacraments. We have some more background knowledge to help us understand that. So we're going to jump right into an article and see what we can make of it. So we are going to look at part 3, question 61, article 2. And that is on the necessity of the sacraments, and the article is whether before sin sacraments were necessary to man. So did Adam and Eve need the sacraments in the garden? Or if we hadn't fallen, if man hadn't sinned, would we need sacraments? So this is the kind of question Thomas Aquinas likes to ask, these hypothetical questions. So it requires a little bit of background knowledge on the sacraments. Most of the articles require some background knowledge to really understand them. You have to understand that the sacraments are what give us God's grace, which help bring us out of sin and help us perfect ourselves, help us to stay in a state of grace, to turn back to God, to give us the grace necessary to get to heaven. So knowing that, we can look at these objections. Now remember, Thomas Aquinas is going to play devil's advocate first. So these objections are not what Thomas Aquinas thinks. He's looking at the other end of the spectrum. He's looking at the other answer before he gets to his answer. So he's going to present objections. So he begins with objection 1. It seems that before sin, sacraments were necessary to man. Now this gives us a clue. This tells us how Thomas Aquinas is going to argue. So if the very first sentence says sacraments were necessary to man, and we know Aquinas is going to play devil's advocate at the beginning, we can surmise from this that Thomas Aquinas' answer is going to be that the sacraments were not necessary to man. So now we know which direction Thomas Aquinas is going to go in. He's going to argue that they were not necessary. So these objections are arguing that they were necessary. So he gives some objections, and he tries to be fair about this. He tries to put forth good objections. He doesn't just put forth a bunch of straw men that are very easy to debate. He tries to really be academically rigorous and honest about this. So the objections he gives, so he says man needs the sacraments to obtain grace, but man needed grace even in the state of innocence. So therefore the sacraments were necessary. So objection 2, he says the sacraments are suitable to man by reason of the conditions of human nature. So man's nature is the same before sin as after sin. And then finally, holy matrimony is a sacrament, marriage. And we know that Adam and Eve were married before they sinned. So since holy matrimony was instituted before sin, he argues here that the sacraments were indeed necessary before there was sin, because the sacrament of holy matrimony existed in the garden. So these are some pretty good arguments, but we know, because he plays devil's advocate first, that this is not what Thomas Aquinas is going to argue. So next, we have Thomas Aquinas' actual answer. So his on the contrary. This is where he provides some authoritative source. He quotes another theologian or scripture or a church father. So here he is quoting Matthew 9:12. On the contrary, only the sick need remedies. They that are in health need not a physician, and the sacraments are spiritual remedies for healing the wounds inflicted by sin. That's what we need that grace for, that sacramental grace. They bring us back to God, they forgive sins. So before sin, that it wasn't necessary. And now we get his I answer that. Remember, that is the meat of the article. This is what Thomas Aquinas actually believes. This is the part you really need to pay attention to. So he answers that sacraments were not necessary in a state of innocence. So this can be proved from the rectitude of that state in which the higher parts of man ruled the lower. So what he's saying is, before we sinned, remember, man is both spirit and physical. We're the only creature that is that blend of an eternal soul, a spiritual soul, and a physical body. So the spirit is higher than our body, and the sacraments help bring us up to the more spiritual level. Our lusts, our inclination to sin, our concupiscence, those are tied more to our physical being, and the sacraments help raise us to the spiritual. So the sacraments use both the physical and the spiritual, and God, he sort of meets us where we are by using the physical and the spiritual together. So, we use the physical, the bread, the wine, the water, those things to help bring us to a spiritual state. And Thomas Aquinas is arguing that if we hadn't fallen, we wouldn't need to use those physical things. It wouldn't be right to use those physical things. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be proper. So that's his argument for why we didn't need the sacraments before sin. And if we hadn't sinned, we wouldn't need the sacraments. So now he's going to go back and he's going to reply to those objections. They were good objections, they were good arguments, so he wants to tell us why they were off the mark. He wants to go back and answer those. So to objection 1, he tells us that in a state of innocence, man needed grace, but not so that he needed to obtain grace by means of sensible signs, but in a spiritual and invisible manner. So remember, our spirit hadn't been damaged, so we didn't need those physical things to help us understand that grace the way we do now. We would have gotten the grace more directly from God. And then the reply to objection 2, man's nature is the same before and after sin, but the state of his nature is not the same, because after sin, the soul, even its higher part, needs to receive something from corporeal things, those physical things, in order that it may be perfected, whereas before that, man had no need of that. And then finally, his reply to objection 3, that Adam and Eve were married in the garden. So matrimony was indeed instituted in the state of innocence, but not as a sacrament, but as a function of nature. So consequently, it's foreshadowed something in relation to Christ in the church, just as everything else foreshadowed Christ. So he's saying it wasn't a sacramental marriage in the garden. So that's an example of a Summa article. So as you can see, even understanding how an article goes, how it's organized, it's still a bit of a challenge because it's not just about understanding the structure, but you also need a lot of background knowledge to understand what he's actually saying, and that is a process, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So for now, what I want to do is something a little bit more fun. So we looked at an actual article, and we can see that that is still a bit of a challenge at this point. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you an article that I wrote myself. This I actually wrote for a bit of fun, to advertise my Summa class that I put on at the parish, and I sent it to Father Phil, and he said no. So, but I still want to use it because I put a lot of work into it. So we're going to use it now. So this is just fun. Why you should take the Summa Theologica class, written in the form of the Summa, so that we can get some practice on the format. Okay, so this is my advertisement. So the question that I'm answering in the form of the Summa is, should you attend the class on St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica? So just like Aquinas with the Summa, I'm going to start out with 3 objections. And remember, these objections are playing devil's advocate. This is not what I think. This is an alternate argument. So objection 1, it seems that the Summa is really hard to understand and is only for expert theologians, and you are not an expert theologian, so you shouldn't attend the class. Objection 2, further, the Summa is boring. And objection 3, further, you graduated from religious ed, so you know everything there is to know about Catholicism, and you're done learning. Now, obviously, these are not what I think. This is my devil's advocate. So next I have, on the contrary. Remember, this is where you quote some authority. Aquinas uses the Church Fathers or the Bible. I'm going to use St. John Paul II, who said, St. Thomas Aquinas is an authentic model for all who seek the truth, which is obviously us. So we seek the truth, so Aquinas is worthwhile studying for us. Now I have my I answer that. That's what I actually believe. This is my meat, remember. So I answer that St. Thomas Aquinas and his greatest work, the Summa Theologica, has something to teach us all. Attending this class will teach you more about the patron of our great parish, my parish is St. Thomas Aquinas, why he wrote the Summa, what it is, and how to read it. And it's also a great way to celebrate St. Thomas Aquinas' feast day, as the original class was held on his feast day. So now I have to go back and I have to reply to the objections. So my reply to objection 1, people of all levels can gain an understanding from studying the Summa if they know how to read it. My reply to objection 2, if you think the Summa is boring, you're probably boring. The Summa asks and answers some of the greatest questions of humanity. And my reply to objection 3, Catholicism is over 2,000 years old, longer if you count all that Old Testament stuff that led up to it. So you could spend 10 lifetimes learning and barely scratch the surface. It is everyone's responsibility to never stop questioning and learning and digging deeper. Come to get an introduction to the greatest question asker and answerer in Catholic history to inspire you in your own learning. So that is the advertisement that I originally wrote for the class, but Father Phil said it was too long, and he probably doesn't want me telling people they're boring, but whatever, I thought it was funny. So for the next part, I actually had the group write their own article of the Summa Theologica. This was just for a bit of fun, and again, just to practice the format, because understanding the format is, I'm not going to say it's half the battle, it's maybe like 1% of the battle, but definitely if you don't get that first 1%, you can't start working towards the other 99. So to practice the format, we wrote our own article. So the question that we chose to answer was, is a hot dog a sandwich? So we came up with some objections. So some people were arguing that a hot dog is a sandwich. You know, it's on bread. It's between two pieces of bread. But then other people were like, oh, but there's only one piece of bread. And then we had to find the definition of the sandwich. So that was where on the contrary came in. We used the Webster's Dictionary definition of a sandwich, although not everybody agreed with Webster on that point. We came up with an I answer that, and then we replied to the objections. So this could be a fun little exercise for you to do on your own, just to practice the format of the Summa and to, have a little bit of fun. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. As you can see, it is almost fully nighttime out now. That took a little bit longer than I was expecting. So the next part is, where do you begin? Now that you have a general idea of how the Summa is organized, how to go about reading it, where do you get started? So first, I want to talk about some resources. There are some good books that you could look at. Peter Kraft has some good ones. There's the Shorter Summa and the Summa of the Summa, which are both just shorter, condensed books. They're still written in the form of the Summa, but Kraft gives a lot of commentaries and tries to help you understand them better. So those are some really good ones. And another one I like that I have my bookshelf right here. This is How to Read the Summa Theologica by Joseph Anthony. This is the book that I pulled the majority of this presentation from. He starts with everything. He starts with who Aquinas was, why he wrote it, why he organized it that way, and then gives good information on how to go about reading it. So this is a highly recommended book if you want to understand more. There are a lot of podcasts out there. There's the Aquinas 101 site, where the Dominican friars are actually putting on a free online course right now to teach you what the Summa is, how to read it, and to start working through building the background knowledge for some of those hard concepts that you really need that background knowledge to understand the articles themselves. There's the Pints with Aquinas podcast, which is Matt Fradd. He asks the question, if you were to sit down with Thomas Aquinas and have a pint of beer with him, what questions would you ask him and how would he answer? So each episode looks at a different question and Matt Fradd tries to answer it the way Aquinas would. So that's a pretty fun one. And then the New Advent website is a just indispensable resource because it has the entire Summa online for free. Now, the actual print Summa is like $300 and it's huge, and someday I hope to get one, but if I don't, the whole thing's available online for free at the New Advent website. You just put it into Google and you can come up with that and you can read through the entire thing. So if you're going to start reading the Summa itself, the question becomes, how do you do that? So there are a few different methods. The first one would be to start at the beginning and try to read it all the way through the whole thing. I would not recommend that. Most people who do that get overwhelmed pretty quickly and give up. So another way of doing it is to look at what you're interested in. If you have a question about the sacraments, maybe you want to learn more about the sacraments, so you read the articles about the sacraments first. Maybe you're interested in the nature of God or a certain virtue, so just go through and look at the ones you're most interested in first, and that high interest might drive your learning that way. Another suggestion is to focus on the I answer that. Remember, we've said multiple times that that is really the meat of the article. That is Aquinas's answers. So you can skip over the objections for now and just focus on Aquinas's answer. That might lower the confusion a little bit, lower the information overload, and then you can go back and read more. So the thing to remember with the Summa is it is huge. I mean, it is a lifelong pursuit to study this thing. It's not something you're going to read through once and then never touch again and understand the whole thing all at once. It's something that the first time you read it through, you might only understand a tiny bit of it, but then you go back and you read it again in a year or two, and maybe you understand a bit more. Then you read it again and you understand a bit more. It's something that you keep coming back to, and every time you come back to it, especially as you gain more background knowledge, as you learn other things, you can start understanding more and more and more of it. It's really like there's more in there than any one person can understand in one lifetime. So again, it's not just a bit of light bedtime reading that you're going to do in a year. Some considerations. St. Thomas Aquinas does use his own particular vocabulary. The language he uses, the way he uses words might be a bit different than what you're used to, and when you first encounter that, it can throw people off. So you can Google Summa vocabulary and read the kinds of words that he uses and how he's using them, and that could help you understand a bit better. Also, the Summa of the Summa and the shorter Summa, those have glossaries in them that can help you start learning Aquinas's vocabulary to understand just a bit more. As we say, each time you read it, you understand a bit more every time. You can read widely to develop that background knowledge, and just enjoy the journey. And don't try and understand it all at once. Don't get frustrated if you don't. It says it's for beginners, but remember, these are beginner theology students. So this is a lifelong process. It's kind of like reading the Bible. You might read something one day and you understand a little bit of it, and then you come back to it and you get something different from it, and you come back to it, you get something different from it. There's layers of meaning, and the more you study it, the more you read it, the more you'll understand it. So just relax, understand the journey, and enjoy.